and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this, our last public event being held in conjunction with the Emperor's Private Paradise, the Treasures from the Forbidden City. This is a remarkable opportunity to get close to a group of furnishings, architectural elements, and decorative arts that have been preserved in this remarkable segment of the Forbidden City called the Qianlong Garden. It's called that because I think he probably made this garden for his mother between her 80th and 85th birthday. So in the year 1776, he opened the garden for his mother. It was part of a retirement palace that he created for her. And this has become a project of the World Monuments Fund working in conjunction with the Palace Museum to restore the 27 buildings that are part of this very special space. It is really the only it's really the best preserved and perhaps the only place where you can see 18th century high Qing art of the imperial style in its almost original state. And so this is just a miraculous site to have been preserved, and it's an extremely important project to conserve. And our speaker tonight, T.K. Mcclintock, has been an integral part of that process. T.K. earned his BA and MA degrees from Boston College and SUNY Cooperstown in History of Art and in Conservation. And then he worked for 11 years for the Northeast Document Conservation Center, where he was a specialist in paper conservation. In 1990, he actually founded his own private studio, Studio TKM Limited, which has continued to work with fine arts restoration and specialization in paper. And it was in that capacity that he was engaged by World Monuments to be a chief consultant on this project at the Palace Museum. And so for 7 years, it was his responsibility to help coordinate the various talented specialists in China and abroad who were working on the restoration of the first of the 27 buildings in this space, the Juanqinzhai. It's the studio of exhaustion from diligent service. So named because the emperor, after 60 years, was intended to actually step down from the throne and retire there. He never did, which is perhaps why the garden remained as well preserved as it did. None of the other emperors who followed him chose to retire either. So as a result, this is an 18th century space that has the challenge of becoming a 21st century museum space. How does one not only conserve the works of art, but coordinate the work of air handling, lighting, traffic, and labeling to turn it into a space that is also accessible to modern audiences? So that's been part of TK's mandate since he joined this project, and he's going to share with us tonight just how he went about that. TK Mcclintock.
Thank you very much, Mike, for the invitation to speak about Juanqinzhai, a building that is distinguished first by the rarity of the interior design, and second by the attention given it to its conservation. The subject is timely, of course, because of the current exhibition upstairs, the Emperor's Private Paradise, and it is opportune because of the subject of conserving historic interiors is reflected in the Met's own display of numerous and important original rooms, such as the Frank Lloyd Wright Little Room on the right and the Studiola on the left. So in the words of Marco Polo, let us now travel into Cathay so that you may learn something of its grandeurs and treasures. And the Forbidden City measures 3/5 by 1/2 mile, and is largely defined by the central axis outlined in blue, which is made up of the ceremonial Ming period structures, such as the Gate of Supreme Harmony circled here in yellow. However, there have been innumerable replacements or additions since the initial period of construction between 1406 and 1420. Between 1771 and 1776, the Qianlong Garden in the northeast corner was constructed on a site measuring 175 by 45 yards as a retirement compound, as Mike mentioned, for the Emperor Qianlong and his family. And this is outlined in red at the top right of the aerial photograph. In the middle is a plan of the garden complex, which illustrates the alignment of its 4 courtyards in a north-south axis, mirroring the organization of the Forbidden City itself. Encircled in red at the top is Juanqinzhai, the Qianlong Emperor's studio of exhaustion from diligent service. The World Monuments Fund, an architectural advocacy and preservation organization based here in New York, established a partnership in the year 2000 with the Palace Museum, Beijing, to fund and assist in its conservation. Juanqinzhai is the most celebrated of the 27 buildings in the Qianlong Garden Complex. It's a traditional Chinese timber frame structure with an interior footprint of approximately 2,400 square feet. The 9 bays of the interior are divided further into 2 entities with very different functions, spatial organizations, and decorative schemes. The entry court on the right and the rooms surrounding it on 2 floors are noteworthy for the applied surface decoration, including the carved hardwoods, veneers, and marquetry. The theater on the left is distinguished by its dramatic 2-story volume with trompe-l'oeil mural paintings on silk, a central stage for theatrical performances, and surfaces painted to resemble a rare variety of bamboo. The 2 sides are unified by the pattern wallpaper and the paintings and works of calligraphy mounted by their margins to the walls. The Qianlong Emperor was the 7th ruler of the Qing dynasty. Oh, hard to believe I make a living with my hands, isn't it?
Share that with curators, by the way.
He reigned from 1735 to 1796 as the absolute ruler of the largest and wealthiest empire of the era, with an estimated population of 300 million. While the Qing dynasty originated outside of China in Manchuria, the interior of Juanqinzhai and the landscaping of the garden reflect his taste for the exotic styles associated with the arts of the Han Chinese in southern China, as well as the enormous resources available to him. And while the Qianlong Emperor famously dismissed the envoy sent by George III in 1793 to establish trade relations with the declaration, quote, "We do not have the slightest need of your country's manufactures," he did in fact appreciate many Western innovations and materials, and most notably for this discussion, the painting style of Giuseppe Castiglione, the Jesuit missionary who served as court painter to 3 generations of Qing emperors, and to whom the design of the murals is attributed, as well as the portrait on the right of the Qianlong Emperor as a young prince. Because of the distinctive interior and the more intimate scale, Juanqinzhai is a particularly cherished work of architecture within the Chinese canon. And while there are well-staffed conservation departments within the Forbidden City specializing in the wide variety of Chinese artifacts contained in its encyclopedic collections, the Palace Museum believed that Juanqinzhai required an approach that differed from the architectural conservation strategy that was used elsewhere, which focused largely on reproduction and accommodation of the traffic inherent to 7 million annual visitors. It identified in the World Monuments Fund, or WMF, a partner through whom their departments could be exposed to the international developments in conservation, interpretation, and project management that they recognized would be crucial for a project of such complexity, duration, and domestic and international interest. What the WMF saw in Juanqinzhai was, foremost, the opportunity to work hand in hand with the State Agency for Cultural Heritage to safeguard a work of irreplaceable architectural and artistic value. It would also fulfill another goal of the WMF project sponsors, the promotion of a more informed understanding by Westerners of the material and cultural heritage of China. The conservation of Juanqinzhai was to be distinguished from other projects in the Forbidden City by its investigation into how the best modern conservation practices could be used to conserve these diverse materials, with different properties of aging and with the goal of an integrated appearance. The many conservators from China and the US brought expertise in different areas of material specialty, but the project also required a number of traditional artisans who could adopt their craft from the creation of new artifacts to the repair and restoration of historic works. And this program to revive the traditional crafts used to decorate buildings originally was essential to achieving the most accurate conservation repairs. The body of knowledge was also significant because Juanqinzhai was identified early on as a pilot project for the conservation of the entire Qinlong complex by the year 2019. Because this larger project required the removal of the contents from all of the 27 structures for storage and conservation, it was possible to generate the current exhibition upstairs of decorative arts that were drawn from it. In addition to the structural conservation, the project for Juanqinzhai was organized around areas for which assistance was specifically requested by the Palace Museum, including conservation of the mural paintings and interior decorative finishes, improvement of the interior environment, introduction of lighting, and development of an interpretation program. Let me now illustrate what conservation aimed to address and the procedures that were used specifically. And I'll begin with the murals in the theater because it was their compromised condition that instigated the project, and it was how I became involved initially. Conservators generally specialize by material. And this is well illustrated at the Met by the assorted departments for paper, paintings, and object conservation that are necessary to care for the wide variety of works in the collection, including one of the few institutional studios in the United States specializing in the conservation of Asian paintings on paper and silk. The studio I direct in Boston specializes in the conservation of both Asian and Western works on paper and silk, and we have a particular expertise in the conservation of murals, such as this English ensemble and the Chinese export painting, both of which also date from the same period as Juanqinzhai. And it might further interest you that the Grisaille painting on the left, which remains in the Lee Mansion in Marblehead, is by the, quote, paper staining manufactory of William Squire in London, the same firm that produced the Grisaille murals in the Met's own Van Rensselaer Hall, pictured on the right. The paintings in Juanqinzhai cover a surface area of approximately 2,700 square feet. The most visible sections depict a mountainous landscape silhouetting the stage, palace buildings as an extension of the area outside of the building, rendered in the Jehua tradition of architectural paintings, and a trellis on a ceiling that is celebrated for its trompe-l'oeil effect of dangling wisteria blossoms. The murals are unified with the decorative features of the space they enclose by the rendering of bamboo beams, columns, and screens which mirror the actual locations of these elements in the building. They were designed for the walls of a building that would be used only in the winter months, to transport the viewer to a summer panorama of flora and fauna that symbolize the bounty and continuity of the Qing dynasty. The use of one-point perspective also reflects the most recent Chinese knowledge of Western introductions. The scholar Nian Shuyao published his treatise on the subject in 1729, after being exposed to the science through his acquaintance with Giuseppe Castiglione, whose own teacher, Andrea Pozzo, published a 2-volume work in 1693, Perspectiva Pictorum et Architecturum, devoted to perspective. The paintings are attributed to Castiglione's assistant, Wang Shuwei. However, there are scholars who believe that the quality of certain passages could only be by the master, and they support the possibility that Castiglione executed more than one set or that portions were salvaged from another building. While the murals are appreciated for the clever organization and expansive quality of their compositions, the use of one-point perspective and the synthesis of Chinese and European methods of rendering associated with the innovations of Castiglione, the materials are distinctly Chinese. They were produced on large sections of silk measuring up to 7 feet high by 23 feet wide, using mineral pigments in a glue binder. They were mounted over a wooden lattice covered with layers of paper and fabric. Because the lattice rides over the walls, damage that might otherwise be transferred to the building from the inevitable movement of the structure is mitigated. Transferred to the paintings from the inevitable movement of the building is mitigated. The separation from the walls also reduced the potential for condensation in such a humid climate, some evidence of which was found in the paintings. Finally, the layers on a lattice would facilitate removal, an eventuality with which the craftsmen responsible for the mural would have been familiar from evidence of earlier campaigns at their overall repair. The murals suffered from numerous large separations and tears, which made them extremely vulnerable to further damage. But there were few large losses except in the corridor adjacent to the windows where exposure was more extreme. In general, there was widespread staining from water damage, surface abrasion, grime, and adhesive residue from less well-executed repairs. And since Juanqinzhai was unavailable for general use since the departure from the Forbidden City of the last emperor Puyi in 1924, much of this damage was aggravated by the increasing porosity of the building and the lack of regular maintenance. The conservation of paintings on silk and paper has a long-standing tradition in China, for which there are records of manuals from as early as the 13th century. In comparison to even the largest scrolls, however, the murals in Juanqinzhai posed unique challenges due to their scale and anticipated duration of treatment. The murals were sufficiently compromised that removal was necessary. Oh, excuse me. They were so compromised that didn't that happen to Giuliani at the convention? The murals were sufficiently compromised that removal was necessary, both for their repair but also to allow access to the building for its repair. And to allow for work to continue on other projects in the Forbidden City, it was necessary first to create a new studio that could accommodate the large size of the individual sections, and you see that on the lower right. So this was a building that the Monuments Fund renovated specifically for this project and continues to be used for other projects. The sensibilities and procedures of conservation found in the Chinese studio tradition profoundly influenced the practice of paper conservation in Japan and eventually Europe and North America. However, these different traditions of practice are not homogeneous. The tools, materials, and procedures that are particular to all of them function in a coordinated manner to address the media, supports, and varieties of formats that are characteristic of the individual artistic traditions. In both Asian and Western practice, however, it is fundamental to determine in particular what moisture is being used to address, the tolerance of the media and the silk or paper support to moisture, and to, excuse me. There we go. I'm awfully sorry. There. So, the moisture is used to both to remove the paintings from the walls, but it will also be used to remove adhesive, to clean the paintings, and to remove the layers on the back to allow the introduction of new linings. Many of the Chinese practices that were historically used on paintings were directly applicable, but our Palace Museum colleagues were also keen on being introduced to materials and procedures outside of their tradition that could be evaluated for applicability to the unusual demands of this project. Briefly then, a conservation project of this type begins with testing of the media to ascertain its sensitivity to moisture. And in this case, the media were reinforced locally with gelatin to render them safe to exposure to water. After which, multiple layers of multiple facings of rayon paper were applied to the surface using a weak adhesive derived from seaweed to protect the surface and absorb the discoloration that would be released when it was exposed to moisture. And layers of mylar were placed on either side to support the sections during handling. And after the painting was turned over, the degraded original lining papers were removed and the losses were filled individually with silk similar to the original. New layers were adhered to the reverse for reinforcement. A first layer of a very soft Schwan paper made from the fibers of a blue sandalwood. And this could be well integrated into the weave of the silk, and a more robust laminate made from a long-fibered Songpi paper made from the paper mulberry plant with a finely woven fabric. These layers were applied using a cooked wheat flour paste as the adhesive, and they were flattened by drying under tension. The Songpi paper, the more robust of the papers, was not available in suitable quality in China at the time. So when the project was developed, we identified paper manufacturers with whom we could work and saw this as an opportunity to revive its production. So after working with paper makers in Anhui province to refine the processing procedures, a paper was produced with the desirable qualities in sufficient quantities and uniformity. In painting, areas of loss and abrasion in the design was shared with another department in the museum, where facsimiles are produced for display in provincial museums or in period rooms where prolonged exposure of the originals would be discouraged. And while the quality of execution was superb, the glazing of discolorations in the most damaged sections reflects perhaps a degree of intervention that is a little bit different than might be undertaken in a Western conservation practice. At the same time, reproduction elements were produced for the corridor, walls, and beams where the original sections were missing. And the numerous paintings and works of calligraphy on the walls were also removed and conserved using similar procedures and remounted by their edges. When the studio work was near completion, the ceilings and walls were prepared for remounting using the original system of multiple layers of paper and fabric over a wooden lattice. And mounting such large sections had to be planned for very carefully. Because they are humidified before they are remounted, they become even more fragile to handle. And there's only a limited period of time, or window of time really, during which the adhesive layer behaves optimally for positioning and attachment. And the expansion from humidification affects the registration between elements as they're mounted. Changes in surface preparation were discussed with our Chinese colleagues, such as including a specific layer for the eventual release of the painting, such as is used in Japanese conservation and as illustrated here during the preparation of the Shoen room in 1984 here in the Met with the Take Oba on the left to display the Kano Sansetsu plum painting. So this layer that we see here allows for the painting to be removed without having to use the same quantity of moisture and therefore have the painting be able to handle with less risk. However, the Palace Museum conservators preferred to use the variation of original system in which the adhesive was applied to the ceiling and walls in a grid pattern that you see in the top left, although this adhesive pattern was changed to distribute attachment more uniformly across the surfaces. The sections were then humidified, rolled up, and unrolled against a pasted surface using guidelines and smoothed out by hand. They were reinforced with padded panels until the adhesive had set, which was about 20 minutes to a half an hour. The wide overlapping seams and borders around these sections concealed the original areas of imperfect fit as they had originally. And I'd like to return now to the period after the murals were removed when the building was accessible for conservation. Juanqinzhai is a Xuandu-style timber frame, column, and tie beam structure with masonry infill walls. It has an overhanging flush gable roof covered with blue-green tiles with a yellow band along the eaves in the jinbian or cut border style of roofing. It's supported by the traditional Chinese framing structure of lintels, beams, posts, bracket capitals, and 30 columns on marble bases on a floor of hard clay pavers, colloquially identified as gold bricks because of the sound they make when struck. The building has a stone foundation raised above the courtyard on a marble stylobate, which has evidence of a hypocaust system for the insertion of charcoal to heat the interior seating platforms, which we see an example of in the lower right, although that is not Juanqinzhai. It's another building in the Forbidden City. As a building intended for winter use, all of the walls are solid except for the one facing south, where 2 or 3 tiers of windows are located. Features that distinguish Juanqinzhai as a Qing period structure include the steeper pitch of the curved roof, the configuration of the capital brackets, the dimensions of the beams, the equal height of the columns, and the ratio of that height to their diameter. The scale of the timbers used indicated that the building was overbuilt for the load it carried. Massive planks also cover the interior masonry walls and were used to create the room partitions and covered with plaster. While generally sound in structure, there were areas where water penetration and inadequate repairs had occurred over the years. Conservation involved lifting back these exterior and interior layers of materials, some robust, others very fragile, to identify where repairs were necessary, then reassembling them using as much of the original building fabric as possible. Where the originals were unsalvageable, the use of reproduction materials and methods was unavoidable, but not unanticipated. How these changes could be appropriately introduced was the source of ongoing exchanges about how traditional Chinese practices could be combined with the equally valid approaches that characterize 21st century conservation. This dialogue was enhanced by a study trip to historic sites and conservation departments in the U.S. by our Chinese colleagues that were considered exemplary, including the Met. The interest of our Chinese colleagues in what they saw here was critical to the viability of introducing new strategies for conservation there. The first concerns were to stabilize the structure and secure the building as a protective enclosure. The roof was rebuilt to replace the sheathing and tile bed, which had been poorly repaired years before, at which time many of the rafters were replaced, while 90% of the glazed tiles were salvaged. The exterior had been repainted so many times that unfortunately no original finishes were in a position to be conserved, so that the appearance was reproduced using historically accurate pigments and gold leaf. Following 3D laser scanning of the interior walls to identify any deformations, the collapsing layers of plaster were removed and the planks were lifted from the walls to inspect the masonry and the enclosed columns behind the planks. Many of the columns suffered from moisture deterioration up to 1 meter from the ground. In response, the site drainage was improved. New sections of wood were fitted into the base of the column using traditional joinery practices, after which the exposed masonry was repointed and the marble bases cleaned. Deteriorations in the plank walls were similarly repaired, and new plaster made from the traditional mixture of clay, brick dust, tung oil, and pig's blood added as a protein binder was applied over hemp and covered with layers of paper and fabric. The hardwood framing and faux bamboo screens were disassembled and removed by furniture craftsmen for conservation off-site. Work on the bamboo veneer covered low relief carvings, and the bamboo thread marquetry required identifying craftsmen from other regions of China for whom these were still working craft traditions, albeit for objects directed at the tourist trade. The materials used for the veneer repair was prepared from large diameter pieces of bamboo from which the exterior was cut away to reveal the interior skin, which was steamed and flattened into page-sized pieces. And you see that being done in the lower left. For the marquetry repairs, strips of bamboo were pulled through gauges and dyed to provide the range of necessary dimensions and colors. These painstakingly prepared materials were then used to fill areas of loss with a traditional protein adhesive. The partitions also held over 200 embroidered silk windows, of which the 50 most intact were conserved by surface cleaning and mending and returned to display on the second floor, while the others were irretrievably damaged were removed for archival storage and replaced with reproductions. And the colors used for these were compromised between the bright originals that were revealed in protected locations and the more soiled and faded examples alongside which they would be displayed. And so you see the middle photograph has an example of an original silk window and a reproduction silk window next to each other to gauge the appropriateness of their display together. The painted surfaces in the theater exhibited some of the most severe deterioration found on the site. The faux bamboo painting, polychrome painting, and lacquer suffered from wide cracks, cleavage and loss, discoloration, and entrenched surface grime. And developing a strategy for such varied materials in such a range of conditions was an enormous challenge, but also a very rewarding area of collaboration. The Palace Museum conservators and technicians were introduced by the architectural paint conservator Susan Buck to the integrated system of material identification using fluorochrome staining and examination under visible and ultraviolet light, and solvent gel cleaning, a system that is used for many purposes in Western conservation. Cross-sections revealed that the faux bamboo design was applied over a traditional clay ground layer using mineral pigments with a tung oil binder, followed by a clear natural resin coating for protection and saturation. Additional layers of paint and pure tung oil were applied in several campaigns over the following years to disguise degradation and to maintain a saturated appearance. But these were separated by clear layers of grime that indicated the large passages of time between their application. This widespread failure of the traditional tung oil binding medium demonstrated its inherent instability, but where the painted surfaces were protected from exposure and recoating, they remained bright in color, and these could serve as benchmarks for both conservation and reproduction. The salvageable faux bamboo finishes were first consolidated with local applications of a protein glue and a synthetic resin, and then cleaned of grime using non-ionic surfactants in water. And the deteriorating layers of tung oil and resin could then be removed with a solvent gel. Approximately half of the faux bamboo painted surfaces exhibited such extensive loss that they could not be conserved and were instead reproduced by craftsmen from the Palace Museum. And I'll go back there to show that on the right. A type of watercolor was used instead of the tung oil for in-painting and reproduction painting, both for greater stability and to distinguish these additions from the original paint layers. Distortions in the lacquer surfaces were softened with heat, re-adhered with a protein glue, and cleaned with a non-ionic detergent. And the losses were built up using the traditional ground layer of lamp black, brick dust, and pig's blood as an adhesive mixture, followed by thin layers of lacquer. And finally, the surfaces were coated overall with a synthetic resin as an isolating layer. After the murals were remounted and the screens were reinstalled, the conserved original finishes and reproduction painted finishes were coated with thin applications of different colors of toned shellacs. And this was done to unify their appearance and to reproduce the original quality of saturation. The system of sampling, analysis, cleaning, isolating layers, in-painting, and final coating with more stable media were all innovations that were outside of traditional Chinese practice and required some experimentation before our Palace Museum colleagues were convinced that an appearance could be achieved that was comparable to what they could do with the materials with which they were familiar. Their embrace of these new procedures is reflected now in their use on other projects in the Forbidden City. The ubiquitous green and white pattern wallpaper had been replaced many times since the construction of Juanqinzhai over 230 years ago, and the number of layers was a ledger of how the original design had become increasingly simplified. The original was relief printed using two printing blocks, a medallion of two dragons encircling a plum blossom printed in malachite green over a geometric background pattern printed in mica. And this was done to reflect the limited light that reached the depths of the interior. Because the surviving printing blocks were too unstable for reuse, the earliest samples were salvaged as models, and a fine art printer reproduced the sheets using new carved blocks, pigments, and songpi paper similar to what was used originally. The salvaged originals were also conserved and remounted in a smaller pair of rooms visible from the entry court. And this was done because the originals that demonstrated the 18th century design were so limited that we only had enough to do 2 small rooms. Others had been either lost or been destroyed by later coverings. The original windows were covered partially with paper and partially with glass imported from Europe, but these had been replaced long ago with new glass over the entirety of their surface. New double-glazed windows with internal shades were installed to improve the insulation of the building and to filter and reproduce the original quality of daylight. And with some exceptions, it was possible to fit these into the original decorative grills and to minimize the incongruity of their modern elements. And while it was decided that even more illumination was needed on the interior, there was a very guarded approach taken to avoid sacrificing the intermingling of light and shadow that is so characteristic of the interior and so effectively evoked by Junichiro Tanazaki's book In Praise of Shadows. And this is a phenomenon that I think we find in many both Chinese and Japanese buildings. So illumination studies were conducted to document seasonal change and to determine where light should be directed and at what levels of illumination. While LED and fiber optic systems were evaluated, a low voltage halogen track system was chosen. In addition to being a more familiar technology to the Chinese in the Forbidden City, the primary advantages of a halogen system were that fewer fixtures were necessary and that there would be flexibility to direct illumination at specific locations and at levels of illumination that we could not determine until after the installation of both the murals and the fixtures themselves. Several scenes or percentages of full illumination for the 30 different zones were developed for tours, scholarly examination, and maintenance. And for the prevailing scenes, it was possible to keep the light levels below 50 lux, which is the standard one tries to accomplish in a museum setting, and such as you would find in the galleries upstairs for the display of drawings. And the heat output could also be minimized with good color temperature rendition. The original design of Juanqinzhai included simple ways to modify the interior environment by opening the windows and by heating the seating areas from the channels in the foundation. After the building envelope was made impermeable and the insulation improved, sensors were placed in multiple locations to develop a record of temperature and relative humidity readings over the passage of an entire sequence of 4 seasons. And after studying the data with an eye to the different materials found in Juanqinzhai that all have different criteria for their display, it was agreed that protection was needed for both the prolonged periods of high humidity that posed a risk of condensation and from the unusually high concentration of airborne particulate matter found in Beijing. And there was great reluctance, however, to introduce a conventional HVAC system because of the alterations that might be necessary to the internal fabric of a structure, this simplicity and elegance of which were much admired. There were also concerns about the unforeseen and unintended consequences of altering the environment of a building to which diverse materials had become accommodated over 2 centuries of exposure. Temperature and relative humidity could not be controlled in the manner of a museum environment at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, plus or minus 5 degrees, and 45% relative humidity, plus and minus 8%, nor would there be any heating in the winter or cooling in the summer directed at visitor traffic. The Forbidden City is an exterior architectural site. People wander in and out of buildings. But the extremes of temperature and relative humidity could be effectively mitigated in a building of such mass by allowing the humidity to drift gradually between a winter low of 30% and a summer high of 60% at temperatures over 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So by limiting to performance objectives, specifications could be developed by our engineers, Shin Maekawa, the Getty Conservation Institute, and Ernie Conrad of Landmark Associates, for an air handler that was modest in scale and therefore much easier to fabricate, install, monitor, and maintain. The encased air handler, which you see prior to its disassembly in the lower left, sits on a spring-loaded chassis suspended from the beams in one insulated bay of the attic. And so here's the insulated bay in the center, in section, viewed from the other side. And it has 3 levels of water protection in case of leaks that fall below here. I haven't used this pen before. I think it's really great. It circulates the air within the building 6 times per hour through a high-efficiency filter. 13 temperature humidity sensors distributed throughout the building, its ducts and through the air handler itself, and form a communication and control system and the logic flow it follows to adjust the dehumidification. So this building is constantly self-monitoring, while still being a very, very simple system. It was also designed to allow future networking of air handlers that might be specified for other buildings in the Qinlong Garden as part of this overall renovation of the complex. However, a major obstacle to the effectiveness of any system was that 220-volt electrical service wasn't available overnight in the Forbidden City as a precaution against fire. However, the importance of improving the environmental conditions within these buildings, within Juanqinzhai and the other buildings in the complex, instigated a major change in policy by the Palace Museum to allow for a full-time delivery of electricity, including Ethernet access for monitoring and control of the system off-site. The Palace Museum also established for the first time a position of environmental manager to ensure that in-house understanding and documentation existed for the operation and maintenance of the system. And consistent with the care given to minimizing modern introductions, the outboard lighting, security, and air handler lines were bundled and camouflaged within the interior by wrapping with materials appropriate to their backgrounds. And here's an example of the vent for the air handling system in the ceiling. From the inception of the project, the conservation strategy was influenced by how the building would be interpreted by visitors, or for visitors. The interiors would have originally been complemented by furniture, textiles, and decorative arts in a manner similar to the depiction in the mural itself, but only 9 objects could be identified that were specifically associated with Juanqinzhai. Enormous consideration was given to how the interior could be presented in a way that would provide visitors with the most complete understanding of Juanqinzhai. One option was to highlight the unusual decorative scheme and the sequence of interior volumes and leave it empty apart from the handful of documented pieces. The eventual decision, however, was to present how the rooms were used during the Qinlong Emperor's occupancy. Additional furniture and decorative arts of the type used were located in storage and conserved, and the fabrics and upholsteries, drapes and carpets were reproduced in Suzhou and Nanjing, the traditional centers of silk production in China. The actual tour program was designed to involve groups of 10 visitors accompanied by guides, entering the entry court for 10 minutes, exiting and re-entering the corridor of the theater for another 10 minutes with lights on automatic timers. And while a little cumbersome in flow, it does minimize visitor traffic through the building, which would otherwise have to be like this, apart from special, more scholarly tours that would allow access to the staircase upstairs and to the other rooms in the entry court. The conservation of Juanqinzhai was completed in November 2008 and was accompanied by both a symposium and a catalog on the subject of its conservation. With the press of so many visitors at once, it became clear that limited visitation was critical for the preservation of interiors that remained fragile even after extensive conservation. In summary, what were the most interesting features of a project in which there was such a large investment of time and resources? And what were the most critical to its successful outcome? The foremost value, of course, was that a unique and cherished work of architecture was preserved for the enjoyment and edification of both Chinese and international visitors. The development of trust between two very different institutions in the integration of their organizations on site were essential. Support at the highest level of the Palace Museum allowed for their staff to make themselves available despite their many other commitments and to do things in somewhat different ways. The give and take about things technical, aesthetic, and procedural established a reservoir of goodwill that was invaluable when difficult decisions had to be made. The emphasis on conservation over replication did require vigilance, with the inevitable need to introduce both reproduction materials and modern elements. The most challenging goals were for the conserved original materials to be preeminent, and for the combination of architecture, murals, furnishings, and applied and painted decorative finishes to have authenticity. It was an extraordinary opportunity to inhabit the Forbidden City, to be exposed to Chinese traditions and practices and methods of conservation, and to work with our Palace Museum colleagues to ascertain where Western materials, procedures, and sensibilities could improve a project that had very different criteria from others in their experience. And while the flow of information from publications, conferences, and electronic resources that swirl around all professions is invaluable in promoting a better understanding of potentially useful approaches from different traditions, in the practice of conservation, there is no substitute for human exchange. The success of Juanqinzhai Conservation Project can be attributed to many, many people. This project happened because the World Monuments Fund President Bonnie Burnham, Vice Presidents John Stubbs and Henry Ng, and China Representative Lo Chong instilled confidence in their partner, the Palace Museum, that Juanqinzhai could be conserved to standards that merit presentation to their public and to the international community. They provided more than funding and additional expertise. They elevated everyone's goals for the project. And it may sound hackneyed, but I was always very proud to have the World Monuments Fund team be the face of America that so many Chinese would come to know for the first time through this unique project. Over the duration of the project, we were shown only the utmost hospitality and interest in our observations by the Palace Museum administrators, conservators, and technicians. They really did the heavy lifting on their project. And the quality of the result is a reflection of their deep experience, craftsmanship, and commitment to the exercise of best conservation practices. Thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have them. Yes, ma'am.
I'm not sure I can describe it, but there's like a banister that has wood framework in it, and then there's an extremely pale, lacy-looking back behind that. What is that made of? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Was it the wainscoting? The equivalent of the wainscoting?
I wouldn't say so. It was like there's the platform. There's a platform, and then there's like a fence around it.
In front of the stage?
In front of the stage, and then behind the decorative wood, there's something that looks like it might be fabric.
Well, there was fabric behind the window. All of the interior windows had a wooden lattice, and there was silk mounted behind those.
Silk.
Yes.
Is that decorated silk?
The silk that I described in more detail was what we call double-sided embroidery. So it would be embroidery on silk that would be seen from both sides.
And it's very pale.
Yes.
Beautiful. Thank you.
I didn't make it. Yes, sir.
You spoke of the reservoir of goodwill that
Mhm.
developed during the process being helpful when difficult decisions had to be made. Could you give us an example or two of the kinds of decisions where different perspectives came to bear with you and your Chinese?
Yeah, I can give you one very specific example. In the course of the lining of the paintings, after the paintings were face down and the all the old layers which no longer adequately support the painting were removed. One of the options, instead of filling the losses individually, was to put an entire sheet of new silk across the back of the painting. And now sometimes that's done in large works of Chinese painting, but it's certainly less time consuming. But it is not as stable because the contact between silk to silk is not as strong as using this Wallpaper first, which integrates itself better into the weave of the silk. So that's what they wanted to do, and we wanted them to fill the holes individually, and they agreed that was, well, after a lot of back and forth, they agreed that was, they would honor our request. That's probably there were remarkably few differences of opinion. It took a long time to come to a synthesis of opinion, but that was more because of the challenging nature of the technical elements that we had to get our arms around, not that there was a difference of opinion. What we would do is we would identify, first of all, what the compromises were that had to be addressed, and then we would come up with multiple solutions or multiple options for solutions and examine them all in a great deal of detail. And it didn't take much to have everyone agree on the best approach for the problem at hand. Yes, ma'am.
It sounded like the way the wisteria ceiling was put up, though, that it won't be as easy to remove as the Japanese example that you had.
You are absolutely correct. And that was, when we first approached this project, we were suggesting a lot of alternatives, and the Chinese were agreeing to a lot of these suggestions. And then it's their project, it's their heritage, and we did defer to them. We would examine the options, and ultimately it's their decision. And there's nothing wrong about their strategy, but it is that might have been an instance where we might have preferred something else, but not so much that it was worth. Their system was somehow inadequate. It was changed to make it a better system. So.
Thank you for this behind-the-scenes view. It's
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. Can you talk about how you communicated with your Chinese colleagues, and also what are the long-range plans? Will you have to periodically go back for upkeep, or
Mm-hmm.
how long will this be?
Well, this will last a long time. It's a very, very solid conservation project. How I communicated with my colleagues? Well, I started out as a conservator with experience in murals. That's how I came on board. And my responsibilities gradually enlarged as the scope of treatment of the building enlarged. And I studied Chinese pretty unsuccessfully for 3 years. I really wanted the basics of when I was on site to say up, down, left, right, forward, backwards, stop. And the China representative of WMF, Lo Chang, who's a phenomenal architectural historian, was on site with me a lot, so I didn't have to worry about translation when he was there. And there were other colleagues from the Palace Museum who also spoke English well enough that we could communicate effectively. There were times where I was there by myself, because I would go over about 4 times a year and spend anywhere from 10 days to a month. And there were times when I was left by myself, and I stumbled along. But for the remounting, which was a really crucial procedure to communicate accurately, we had a Chinese-American intern, Grace Jan, who actually worked at the Met at one point, who came over as an intern in their department, and it was more coincidence that she happened to be there during the reinstallation, and that was essential to have really accurate discussions of moisture content of adhesives, strategies for applying these very large pieces of silk to the ceiling, and that wouldn't have been successful without having that type of translation available. And in terms of monitoring, well, my job was to steer this project as an on-site conservation project, and then the Chinese are perfectly capable of taking it over and taking the strategies of project management that they saw used effectively and applying those to the other 27 buildings. And they were very, at least the impression I got from discussions with them, is they were really pleased to work with the WMF and get exposed to kind of this whole can-do attitude about things, and at the same time, have very elevated standards for how you're going to introduce new materials and new technologies and have them defer to the older materials and have everything well integrated. And I think the likelihood of success for the other 27 buildings is great, and I know that there are while I'm not working on that portion of it because it doesn't have the type of paintings that Juanqinzhai has, I know from discussions with WMF and people working on it still that it's still continues to be a really fruitful exchange. Mike?
Hey, why do you think the original mural paintings were done on silk instead of on paper?
This was an unusually robust silk. It was an unusually thick silk, and I think I was actually going to ask you the same question. I think there were a couple of reasons. One is that you could make pieces that were much larger. That was one reason I thought. The other was, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, is that silk would have been traditionally thought of as a more prestigious material as a painting support. I'm not sure that the properties of aging are necessarily proportionally more with a silk this thick. However, I think this survived better as a painting on silk than it would have on paper. I think the overall exposure of silk is less susceptible than if it was paper, particularly Schwann paper, because it's so short fibered.
I would have said that the use of heavy mineral pigments would probably also preference silk over paper. But was there a ground
No.
underneath, or is the heavy color was applied directly to
Directly to very heavily sized silk, yeah, no ground layer. It was very unusual in that regard. Yes?
You briefly mentioned the smaller rooms in the back of
Mhm.
the, I guess, the entrance hall. Were there any of these kinds of paintings in those, I'm assuming, more private rooms?
Most of the paintings in those rooms are what we called tableaux. So they're paintings that varied in size, but might be 4x3 and larger, that would be adhered by their edges to the walls. And those were largely works of calligraphy, many of which are in this exhibition, or paintings similar to that. They would be adhered by their edges. There was one instance of a completely wall size painting in Juanqinzhai of a landscape. They were the variety one would expect, landscapes, flower paintings, a lot of calligraphy.
So did those rooms go under the whole process of conservation?
Yeah.
as well?
The entire building was conserved. The entire building was stripped down to its bones and rebuilt. Any more questions? Oh, yes, sir.
I just had a comment that I
Sure.
made to make earlier. Your presentation was so valuable, and it just expanded our understanding of the whole project.
Hmm.
Brought all sorts of elements that you didn't see other ways in this
Mhm.
process. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Yeah.
On that note, I think we should thank PTA.